ma dalee commencé liggéey bi yokkute bu bari am nañ ko ci.
This is a Sky News special on the war in Ukraine, live from Lviv in the west of the country. Tonight, rescuers are trying to reach hundreds of people feared dead after a theatre was bombed in Mariupol. Civilians bear the brunt as Russian forces fail to advance around Kiev. Western intelligence suggests the invasion has largely stalled on all fronts, and Ukraine claims a fourth Russian general has been killed. Also ahead, President Zelinsky visits a hospital in Kiev to meet those injured in the war. And how the conflict in Ukraine is causing Ireland to question its traditional neutrality. Hello, good evening. We're live in Lviv in western Ukraine. It is day 22 of Russia's invasion, a campaign which, according to Western intelligence, has stalled on virtually all fronts. But the Ukrainian people continue to pay the price for Russia's conflict. In Mariupol, a rescue effort is underway after the bombing of a theatre where more than 1,000 people were thought to be taking shelter. We'll get more on that in just a moment, but first... Let's take you live to New York and an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council to discuss the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. We'll take you there, of course, as soon as that happens. Well, let's get the very latest then from Martha Kellner. What can we expect?
Yeah, this is an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council called by the UK and 5 other countries to address the worsening humanitarian situation in Ukraine. They also want to address what they say is a risible situation. That situation is this. Russia, which is also a permanent member of the UN Security Council, like the UK, has drafted what they say is a humanitarian resolution on Ukraine. They say this is about addressing the escape of innocent civilians from Ukraine, but that draft document doesn't make any mention of the war itself or indeed Russia's role in this invasion. I was speaking to a member of the UK delegation earlier. They said this humanitarian resolution put forward by Russia is outrageous. They say that Russia is clearly the aggressor in this situation, and they want to make that clear when this meeting happens. We believe it's just about to start today. They say that calls for a ceasefire by Russia in this draft document are outrageous because Russia has repeatedly broken ceasefire agreements already. So this meeting really is about an attempt to dictate the narrative in this situation. They don't want Russia, who will also have the opportunity to speak this afternoon, to be able to put forward their stories of fake news. They instead want to draw upon what the UK ambassador, Barbara Woodward, the ambassador to the UN, says are some of the worst atrocities being committed by Russia in this war. We expect her, for example, to mention the bombing in Mariupol of the theatre where innocent civilians were sheltering. We also expect her to mention the attack on the maternity hospital and to reflect the plight of those 3 million Ukrainian refugees. You'd expect this to be a heated meeting, though, because the Russian ambassador to the UN, Vasily Nebenzia, will also have the opportunity to speak. He's repeatedly decried reports of Russian attacks on civilians in Ukraine as fake news. They say it's simply not true that Russia is the aggressor here. So you can expect to hear 2 competing narratives there. But certainly the UK ambassador to the UN, Barbara Woodward, says that she wants to get the reality of the situation out there in this security meeting before Russia have the chance to dictate the narrative.
Martha, looks like they're just getting themselves settled. We will, of course, listen in to more of that a little bit later on. In the meantime, in the capital, Kiev, attacks have continued in residential areas, but any major Russian advance seems to have stalled. 1 person was killed, others injured after an intercepted missile hit a residential area this morning. Well, 3 weeks into this conflict, the will to defend the city remains strong, and Ukrainian resistance has kept Russian forces to the outskirts. Our special correspondent Alex Crawford reports now from Kiev.
The terror caused by these attacks cannot be overstated. Their life's work and all their possessions blown away in an instant. By chance, the family weren't here, and they're still very much in shock.
I'm so sorry. This is the kitchen. That is utterly destroyed.
The Russian troops have stopped short of entering Kiev, but they're wreaking horror inside the homes of its residents from afar.
Oh my goodness, complete devastation here.
The windows just blew in, he says. Any stalling of the Russian offensive means nothing to those at the end of their missiles. I don't even know how to describe this, Mikhailo says. I don't have the words. He pauses. He can't quite find strong enough phrases for what his family's going through right now. There is no humanity here. This is not war with some army, he says. This is war with humans, just eliminating other humans. This is an atrocity for which no judge would ever find any justification. It's madness, he says. And few right now would disagree with him. On the other side of the street, his neighbours took the full brunt of the blast. The front garden's now a 15-foot deep crater.
This has landed right in the middle of a very, very suburban area. All around here are residential homes, many of which were still occupied, and this is exactly what the International Criminal Court is investigating, a potential war crime.
We're shown the remnants of the missile. They're desperate here to ensure those who attacked them are held accountable. The blast has made this home's front entrance impassable, so we're taken in through one of the damaged windows. The Russian soldiers seem to have been held back from encircling the main city. But they're now resorting to long-range attacks which are indiscriminate and terrifying.
This is just utterly a whole family house just reduced to ruins and rubble. Every room is like this with holes blasted through it.
How safe do you feel living here now? Of course I don't feel safe here, he says. Where is safe now? There's shooting, bombing, rockets hitting us. We live here, but we know it's very dangerous here. Few feel safe in a capital where random strikes can happen anywhere, anytime. Ukrainian defences have somehow held off the Russian forces from their main city, but they can't stop the horror unfolding here. This is the raw pain of knowing someone you love has gone and your life will never be the same. It's heartbreak being replayed all over Ukraine. This bombardment may be a desperate attempt to break the capital's spirit. Russian troops look like they're struggling to complete their strangulation of the capital anytime soon. But for both sides, Kiev is everything, and that might mean more erratic and wretched war actions ahead. Alex Crawford, Sky News in Kiev.
Well, possibly as part of that strangulation, Russian airstrikes have also targeted a food storage warehouse on the outskirts of Kiev. NBC's Richard Engel has been on the ground there and inside the destroyed building.
Russia has now clearly resorted to siege warfare. It has surrounded the city of Mariupol, and here in Kiev, it seems that Russia wants to starve people out. This was one of the country's biggest food storage facilities, and it's completely destroyed. There were 50,000 tons of food here, and the way it worked is food would come from all over the country, be stored here, trucks would pick it up, and then distribute it to the areas all around Kiev. And it wasn't just bombed once. This was no accident. You could say, well, maybe the Russians hit it by accident. It's a large place. It was hit twice, and then another food storage facility just about a mile from here was also attacked. So 3 strikes seems like it could not have been a coincidence, and that Russia is attacking civilians, it's surrounding cities, and it's trying to starve people.
Engel there. Well, the UK Defence Secretary has accused Russia of playing dirty tricks after he was targeted by an imposter posing as the Ukrainian Prime Minister. Ben Wallace said he became suspicious and ended the call after what he described as misleading questions. Mr. Wallace was in Warsaw today, where he announced new military support to help protect Polish airspace. Well, the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelinsky has visited a hospital in Kiev to meet those injured in the war. He spoke to hospital staff and patients, including a family who had come under Russian attack while they were trying to flee from a village on the outskirts of the capital. He also met an injured reservist and the driver of the killed journalist Brent Renault. Well, are we starting to see the signs of progress in talks between Russia and Ukraine? Despite the bombings, both sides are continuing to negotiate via video link. There are reports that any peace deal could see Ukraine renounce its bid to join NATO and promise not to allow foreign military bases or weaponry into the country in exchange for protection from allies such as the US, UK and Turkey. Well, Sky's Alistair Bunkle joins me now with more. Bring us up to date then, Alistair. Emmanuel Macron also hoping to speak to both presidents today.
Yeah, the French president is looking to speak to the Ukrainian and Russian presidents tonight. Emmanuel Macron has been in regular contact with both to try and find some sort of a diplomatic way forward, as have other leaders, but the French leader has been quite key to that. We do see more promising signs coming from both sides. I was speaking to Western officials earlier on today who suggest that both sides are taking the talks very seriously in their opinion, but they believe there's also very big gaps between the two. There have been reports that a 15-point peace plan has been put down for consideration. So what might that involve and what sort of negotiations are we looking at? Well, one is the option that Ukraine might declare neutrality. What does that mean? Well, there are a number of European states that are neutral. Switzerland, obviously, famously, but also Ireland, Finland, Sweden, Malta as well, Austria. And what it means is that they won't then join a military alliance like NATO, and they would pledge not to get involved in any foreign conflicts and not to have any foreign militaries based within Ukraine. So, for example, the United States could not place a large number of US forces in Ukraine, or perhaps even nuclear weapons if they wanted to, as they do elsewhere in Europe. So that is the issue of neutrality that seems to be on the table. Another issue that is almost certainly up for discussion is the future of the disputed regions of the Donbass and also Crimea. Crimea was annexed by Russia in 2014, and Donetsk and Luhansk in the Donbass have been the subject of conflict ever since then. I was at a cemetery earlier on today. If you think this conflict has only started in the last couple of weeks, that's not true. Russian and Ukrainian soldiers, rather, have been dying ever since 2014, fighting in those areas. So what would happen to them? Well, the Ukrainians want them back. They believe that those areas are part of Ukraine and that they should have them back. The Russians obviously feel the opposite. And actually, just after the Russian invasion 3 weeks ago, there was a vote in the Duma in Moscow, the Russian parliament, to declare Donetsk and Luhansk independent. So obviously the future of those regions of Ukraine would be up for negotiation as well. And then there's a lot more else besides. So a lot to work through. Depending on who you talk to, you get different answers as to how close they are to some sort of ceasefire.
And the language has certainly ratcheted up between the US president and the Russian leader. Joe Biden yesterday declaring President Putin a war criminal. Well, Mr. Putin yesterday also talking about scum and traitors and the need for purification. It's not a great backdrop, is it, for peace talks, Alistair?
No, President Biden's words were aimed at the Russian president. President Putin's words, which you just quoted there, were aimed at the Russian people and people within Russia itself who were not supportive of this cause, of President Putin's cause. Really dangerous words, very, very chilling for people who live in Russia and who might not support this invasion. The military invasion has all but stalled. That is the opinion of most Western militaries. They have failed to even encircle Kiev, the capital, let alone actually move ground forces inside or even take out the leadership of President Zelinsky and his aides. They have stalled in most other areas as well. We're starting to see small, but nonetheless, Ukrainian advances or recapturing of land. Don't underestimate the Russians, though. They still have force power behind them. They still have military might, and they still have the capability, if they want to, and it looks like they might want to flatten cities and to carry on this bombardment of urban centres for much longer if they need to.
Yes, and certainly, Alistair, we heard the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken talking about the prospect of mercenaries joining the fight, possibly from Syria, so that is also of concern. Alistair, thank you. So let's get more analysis then on the ground. Let's get the very latest now with Kamali Melbourne at the Sky News Centre.
Well, I'm joined by Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell, who's an advisor at the Universal Defence and Security Solutions Organisation. Sean, thanks so much for being with us. So we've seen this map for a number of days now with Russian forces making advances, but many people will be thinking that it looks as if the Russian forces have stalled. Is that a fair assessment of what's happened?
Well, I think we've all become addicted to some of these pictures of seeing how the red grows as the Russian invasion progresses. And yet, as you say, it hasn't seemed to have changed much. Now, the very language you use there, I think, is telling. Stalled implies that the Russians are having trouble. It implies some hope from Ukraine. And that's one explanation. Another explanation, obviously, is that you've got the Russian Goliath to the Ukrainian David. And actually, what's happening here is a massive resupply as Russia prepares itself with fuel, armaments, food, etc., preparing for its next push on its strategic priorities.
And what does it tell us, with the map being like this and being sort of static at this point, about how well the Ukrainians are defending territory that they hold?
Yeah, I think the Ukrainians are clearly doing an outstanding job. They're massively outnumbered, but of course it's not just the military, it's also civilian population who have taken to arms, and they are proving incredibly resilient, incredibly courageous against a very determined adversary. And of course they've managed to pull the Russians into the urban fight, which of course favours the Ukrainians. I've also seen a little bit of pushback, so they are mounting some fightbacks as well, which tactically might not be strategically significant, but are absolutely causing the Russians to think twice, because rather than owning the agenda, the Russians are being pushed back by counterattacks, which is brilliant.
Back to Moscow, but definitely stopping them from getting further in.
That's right.
Which keeps them guessing. Well, let's take a look at where there has been some movement in this war. We know that the city of Kherson in the south has been taken. Of course, there was a bombing on the city of Mariupol yesterday. Just talk us through the strategy you think we understand is happening for the south of the country right now.
Yeah, the difficulty is we've got to get inside Putin's head, which is very difficult to do. But most likely is that, obviously, to the north, Kiev would be a strategic priority. But also, if you look back 200 years, Russia owns the whole of this coast. And therefore, if you're subscribed to the view that Putin hails back to those days of the former Soviet Union, then actually what he's trying to do is take the whole coast again. And as the first step of that, he would want to link Crimea to the south to Mother Russia. And of course, that would explain the ribbon of land up there. The problem is, with Mariupol still causing a difficulty for him, that's undoubtedly going to be a priority. And if you look to the west, Odessa is another one of his, I would expect it to be a strategic priority. The challenge there is it's so far away. It's 1,000 miles away as the crow flies from Russia. So I think we're seeing some of the naval ships and armaments massing to try to give Odessa a bit of a hard time as well.
OK, Sean, I do appreciate the assessment. Thank you very much for that.
Well, let's talk more about Odessa, shall we? Russian warships have been spotted off the shore of that strategic port city. There are fears that the city may be in line as a major target, as we heard there. Ukraine's third largest city is strategically important, of course, to Vladimir Putin. If he can take that, he can cut off the country from the sea. That's Ukraine, of course. People have put sandbags on the beaches. They've blocked doorways. They've blocked windows and roads, and huge steel crosses have been placed in the streets too, designed to stop tanks and military vehicles in their tracks. Let's hear more now from our correspondent there, Nick Martin.
Well, we woke up this morning to dreadful news that looked like was coming out of Mariupol. There was a shelter there with hundreds of people inside, and we know because we've seen pictures of that shelter with the words children written in Russian on either side of the end points of that. An indication from the sky to anybody that this is not a target. And then there were some reports overnight that that building had been hit. And for a period of time, there was a lot of worry about the men, women and children who were inside there and, you know, what had happened to them. And then this morning, some official reports from the Ukrainian authorities suggesting that it had been hit, but that they had all survived. Now, we're trying to just get a few more details, some evidence, some picture that'll filter through as to exactly what the situation is there. But if that's true, and if that pans out, then that has been a miraculous escape. And I suppose that writing on the floor is particularly telling. That is how desperate they are in Mariupol now. There is no more they can do than appeal to the humanity of their enemies by writing the words children in massive white letters on the ground to say, please do not bomb this building, we are not the enemy. And yet it was struck. This morning here in Odessa, just a few hundred miles to the west here, another key city port here, we were woken up by sounds of an explosion. It rattled the windows. Now, we've got no more information other than the sound of it. We don't know whether that was defensive outgoing fire from the Ukraine military or whether that was something that had been fired in from the Black Sea and had landed somewhere and we felt the aftershocks. That's the situation we're in here in Odessa. To all intents and purposes, it is quite quiet here today. People are getting on with their everyday business, but there are huge defences being put up now because it is inevitable, I think, that at some point the Russians will try and have a go at this key port city. And there are still families who have stayed here. There's a play park in the city centre that we'll go into in a minute. There are children playing on swings. There are parents taking their children out for walks. The markets are open. People, you get the sense, are trying to get things in while they can because the situation can change very quickly. We've seen in Mariupol, further up the coast in Mykolaiv, another port city, the shells starting to land there as well. And these port cities obviously strategically very important to the Russian military. So early signs here in Odessa, although we can't really be sure what those explosions were this morning, but it didn't sound good from where I was sitting. And all the city can do is kind of fortify itself and prepare for what might come.
Nick Martin, who I spoke to a little earlier. Well, Arnold Schwarzenegger has made an appeal directly to the Russian people and Russian troops also in Ukraine, telling them they are being lied to by their government.
I'm speaking to you today because there are things that are going on in the world that are being kept from you. Terrible things that you should know about. You see, Ukraine did not start this war. Neither did nationalists or Nazis. Those in power in the Kremlin started this war. I regret to tell you that thousands of Russian soldiers that have been killed.
Well, this is a Sky News special on the war in Ukraine. Coming up, I'll be speaking to a former Prime Minister of Finland and hearing how the war is leading Ireland to consider its military neutrality.
I am there to speak truth to power. To ask the questions that people want answered. Yeah, good to see you. When I'm interviewing a politician, it's a more rapid fire, but this is not. This is a conversation. The format of the show, so we're going to have an hour-long interview show once a week on a Thursday night. It's at 9 p.m. It's a moment to press pause on this frenetic pace of news and just reflect on things. And when we do have a politician on the show, you might see them interviewed by me in a different way than you perhaps normally see it. What they do, why they do it. If I can find some of that and bring it onto Sky News, I'd be really happy.
The government is confirming that they are now engaged with Russian soldiers. Air raid sirens fill the airways.
In the distance, artillery rains down.
It feels very close to the centre of... There's one.
They found this devastation to their apartment.
Lots of people live here. Quite a few of the windows of the houses have been blown out by the blast.
And it feels that it's changing each day.
I'm Greg Milam, Sky's US correspondent here in Los Angeles.
Can you go away?
We take you to the heart of stories that shape our world.
I love my job because I get to do something that is contributing to a better future.
Well, this St Patrick's Day, Ireland's long-standing neutrality is being hotly debated. The war in Ukraine and the arrival of thousands of refugees has prompted calls for the policy to be scrapped and for Ireland to finally send lethal equipment to the Ukrainians. Our Ireland correspondent Stephen Murphy has more.
The sunflower joined the shamrock and yellow and blue tinged the green as the first St Patrick's Day parade in 3 years took place in Dublin. Members of the Ukrainian community led the parade with a message of solidarity. The Russian invasion has seen thousands of refugees welcomed here, and it's also opened a debate on one of the central planks of Ireland's identity, its neutrality. The Javelin anti-tank missile being fired by Irish soldiers in County Wicklow. Ireland has a small stockpile of the weapon, but won't send any to Ukraine because Ireland is a neutral country. It's a policy almost as old as the Irish state. Ireland was even neutral during World War II. Now, though, with war in Europe once more, it's suddenly being challenged. These are members of the Army Ranger Wing, Ireland's Special Forces. Cathal Berry used to be one of them. Now he's a politician, calling for a real debate on neutrality.
Absolutely. To be honest, it's long past time, and the situation in Ukraine has really focused our minds. It's probably a defining moment, really, because let's remember, Russia has threatened Ireland as a member of the EU for slapping sanctions on the Kremlin, and they could become very, very aggressive towards Ireland in the next few weeks. And it's important that we're able to defend ourselves.
Ireland has taken in thousands of Ukrainian refugees and is spending more than €30 million in aid. But when it comes to military equipment, it's restricted to non-lethal things like body armour and rations. Since the invasion of Ukraine, Ireland's military neutrality has been under scrutiny like never before. The Irish government says such a long-standing policy can't be changed overnight, but it does now accept that it's up for debate.
I think there's certainly an openness now in Ireland to discuss issues around common security and defence in a way that is more proactive and more open to a change in policy. And I think the Irish public will be comfortable with that, given what we're seeing and the brutality that we're seeing coming from Russia in Ukraine right now.
Opinion is divided on the streets of Cork, home to the country's naval base.
I'm all for neutrality. I don't want us to be giving that up or sacrificing that in any way, shape or form.
When you see what's going on in Ukraine, no, I think it's time to make a change. You know, it's we need to mature ourselves, I think, and come along. You know.
I disagree totally. Absolutely, keep our neutrality. Absolutely, yeah.
For now, Ireland remains in a crisis of conscience, treading the line between its much-cherished neutrality and making a more deadly contribution to the defence of Ukraine. Stephen Murphy, Sky News in Dublin.
Well, let's show you the scene now in New York, where an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council is underway ahead of a vote tomorrow. As you can see, humanitarian aid is key to this, and there is the WHO Director General.
Thanks to donors,
by additional funding from the UN Central Emergency Response Fund, SERF. However, to sustain the response, we call on donors to fully fund the United Nations Emergency Appeal. As the Undersecretary General said, it's only 36% so far funded. We thank those donors who have already pledged funding to meet the needs of people in Ukraine. And third, although Ukraine is rightly the focus of the world's attention, I urge you not to lose sight of the many other crises in which people are suffering. In Afghanistan, more than half the population is in need, with widespread malnutrition and a
Yes,
surge
clearly there
in
are some very critical issues for the people of Ukraine. Food in those conflict areas being one, medicines as well, which is no doubt why he is there giving his assessment. We are expecting to hear from the US ambassador to the UN shortly, so we'll keep an eye out for that during this Sky News special programme on the war in Ukraine. But we will also talk about the chances of a negotiated end to the conflict with the former Prime Minister of Finland. And here is Linda Thomas-Greenfield, US representative to the UN.
They reported terror, the terror that Russia is inflicting across Ukraine on the Ukrainian people. Russia will be held accountable for its atrocities. There's only one way to end this madness. President Putin, stop the killing, withdraw your forces, leave Ukraine once and for all. Yesterday, I listened to President Zelinsky's speech to the United States Congress, and I was so moved by his words, his bravery, and his calls for help and for peace. Immediately afterward, President Biden announced another $800 million in security assistance to help Ukraine defend itself. That's more than $1 billion in the past week alone. We're not doing this by ourselves. Our allies and partners are fully committed to surging assistance to the Ukrainians. And we are grateful to all of our allies and partners who have opened their borders and their hearts and welcome Ukrainian refugees. We're also going to continue to provide humanitarian relief to support people within Ukraine and those who have been forced to flee, including the $186 million in additional assistance that Secretary Blinken announced on Tuesday. Here at the United Nations, we believe the best way to address the humanitarian crisis is through a resolution in the UN General Assembly. The resolution in the General Assembly will reflect the views of the overwhelming majority of UN member states and Ukraine itself. The International Court of Justice issued a profound and important order yesterday to the Russian Federation, and we call on Russia to comply immediately.
Minutes with them so far.
Russia has clearly violated international law by violating the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Russia's brutal tactics have killed civilians.
Well, we will return to that very shortly, but right now I do want to bring in the former Prime Minister of Finland, Professor Alexander Stubb. Good to see you. And before we came to the US ambassador there, she was talking about the incident in Mariupol, where it appears a Russian attack struck at a theatre where people were taking shelter, the building clearly labelled with the word children on. I know you were instrumental in bringing about a ceasefire in Georgia. How badly does this country need a ceasefire right now?
But it's one of these moments when, you know, idealism meets realism. I just don't see that ceasefire coming. And the reasons are very simple. I think the stakes for Vladimir Putin are too high. In Georgia, it was fairly easy to do that in 5 days. But I think in Ukraine, he's looking for a big war and a big peace. And to be honest, if I was President Zelinsky, there would be very little that you can compromise on at the moment.
Do you think, actually, the world has already caused so much harm to President Putin, he feels like he's got nothing to lose? Is that why he's after a big war, as you put it?
Well, I think, you know, he has a stated aim, and that is historical Great Russia, which for him includes Belarus and Ukraine. So that's his sort of vision. He wants to create his own legacy. You know, he wants to be there with the Stalins and the Ivan the Terribles and Peter the Greats of Russia as a great leader. And I don't think he will do anything that stands in his way to stop it. And the problem, of course, is that he can't lose face, and he knows that. So therefore, you know, we're into the 4th week in this war, and he's not looking extremely good and probably getting increasingly desperate as well.
So what are his options now? What will his end game look like?
It's very difficult to say. I mean, I think there are 3 options in this conflict, as there quite often are. One is the withdrawal of Russian troops. Obviously, he's not looking for that. The other one is to split Ukraine into 2, Eastern and West Ukraine. The Ukrainians will never allow that to happen. And thirdly is that he goes all the way and tries to take over Ukraine. So I think all of the options, I mean, the first one is the one that I'd love to see, but the 2 other ones are quite horrific, to be honest. But, you know, as I said earlier, I think this is going to be a protracted long-term conflict. So we're not talking only about weeks, but most probably months.
Well, it is already horrific, as you know. So how do you hold on to a nation when they begin to hate you?
For Putin, obviously you have a couple of things there. You have to remember that in the DNA of Russian culture and history is this sentiment that the rest of the world is against Russia, and Russia is isolated and surrounded, attacked from the east by the Mongols in the olden days, and now formerly by the Nazis, and now by the Westerners. So there is this sort of psyche that, what's going on is we have to fight for Russia and Russian identity. But of course, it's going to be a combination of things. So one is the sanctions, a country that is moving towards a potential default. The other one is the fact that Ukraine might be able to push back. But in Russia, what you need is basically a bottom-up movement to get rid of any leader that you have. And I think this has to come from the inside. We can't force change.
Well, what about that idea of pushing back then? How do you see the Ukrainians fighting this, and how do you reckon they've gone so far? And how does it compare with what Finland did back in 1939?
Yeah, there are some elements, obviously, of the Winter War. 1939 lasted for 101 days. And there's this sort of sentiment, almost of heroic nostalgia when we're watching the Ukrainians fighting. And the parallels are there and are not. The parallels that are is that when you're attacked by a big aggressor, for us it was the Soviet Union, for Ukraine, it's Russia, your sort of sentiment of defending and protecting your country goes beyond the call of duty, so to speak. Whereas the attacker, in other words, the Russian soldiers, some of them are wondering, what are we actually doing here? Why are we doing this? The second one is that they are now being fed with arms, with financial aid, with humanitarian aid. And the longer this goes on, the more convinced I am that actually Ukraine and President Zelinsky can push back. And in that sense, things are not looking very good for Putin. This is only an educated guess. I'm not a military expert.
Well, they can push back. Are you actually suggesting you think the Ukrainians can win this?
Well, again, this is where idealism meets realism, and I can't give you an answer on that. But I would argue that if you're looking at victory over the hearts, minds, and souls of the rest of the world, the Ukrainians have already done that. And if you're looking at defeat in terms of showing the weakness of your military, then Putin has already done that. So in that sense, I would argue that the Ukrainians have already won. But then the final issue here is the end state. Are they going to be able to maintain the independence and sovereignty of Ukraine and its territory? That's going to be the key.
We were just seeing a piece there from Ireland questioning their own neutrality. Where does Finland stand on this, on NATO neutrality and all those questions that have been prompted by this war?
Well, I certainly wouldn't compare Finnish and Irish neutrality, because ours during the Cold War was one of necessity, with 1,340 kilometers of border with Russia. When the Cold War ended, we immediately ditched the notion of neutrality, joined the European Union, joined the Euro, have very close partnership with NATO, participate in NATO operations and also in NATO training. Our military is more NATO compatible than that of many member states. And we were very quick to send arms to Ukraine as well. But this has obviously shifted public opinion on NATO membership. We used to be 50 against 24. Now, the latest opinion poll is 62% in favor of NATO membership and 16 against. So if I may predict with my academic glasses on, the train has left the station and eventually Finland will join NATO.
Very interesting. So many implications from this conflict, certainly. Professor Alexander Stubb, former Prime Minister of Finland, thank you very much indeed for your time. Much appreciated.
My pleasure.
Well, still to come on this Sky News special on the war in Ukraine. After an address to the German Parliament today, we'll talk about the Ukrainian president's campaign to build support for his country around the world.
push the protesters further back here. There's around 200 or 300 still remaining.
I'm Dan Whitehead and I'm Sky News' West of England correspondent. This van goes onto the streets of Plymouth 7 days a week, 365 days a year.
These facilities at the moment are a lifesaver. It's all we've got.
From fishing communities to bustling cities, we spend every day reporting from across the region, hearing from people who have real stories.
I'll have nowhere to live for about 3 or 4 months.
There are still people inside the properties here. They are coming from the epicentre of what is now a global health pandemic. We were seeing and speaking to young women who were selling themselves right on the high street. It was desperately sad, and the fact it was happening right in the heart of this community. Before Brexit, these oysters were being exported to the EU, but the trade stopped overnight.
What's your feeling about the future then?
Blake, might all be finished, I don't know.
Well, Ukraine's President Zelinsky has addressed Germany's parliament this morning, telling members that some sanctions came too late to stop the war.
We asked you about preventive sanctions. We urged Europe to many countries. We urged you. So such sanctions that the enemy felt that you are a force, but you delayed. We understood that you wanted to support your economy.
Well, over the past week, Mr. Zelinsky has certainly given a masterclass in how to pitch his message to Europe and the United States and Canada indeed, quoting Shakespeare and Martin Luther King and tailoring his address with well-chosen historical parallels. So let's talk more. I'm joined now by Sudha David Wilk, who is the Deputy Director of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, who joins us from Berlin. Certainly quoting Churchill to the UK, Martin Luther King, as we heard yesterday, for America. What did Germany get to hear?
Hi, good evening. Yes, Germany got to hear the metaphor of the wall. President Zelinsky really urged Germans to think about their past and how today a new wall has emerged, holding back freedom. But the tone of the speech was quite different than Washington yesterday and London earlier in the week, because Zelensky also took the opportunity to sort of lay into Germany about past choices and also about current links with Russia. So I think the German government knew that criticism was going to come, and they did receive that on the floor of the Bundestag today.
So two issues that you mentioned there. One was, I suppose, the reluctance at the start to provide defensive munitions and hardware to Ukraine. The other one, of course, is about the gas reliance, I guess, and that relationship with Russia. So first of all, give us a sense of why Germany was so slow in accepting that actually you needed to arm the Ukrainians to be able to fight this fight.
That's right. I mean, Germany has now ushered in a new era, a so-called turning point. And we saw, signs of that even before the speech that Scholz gave in Parliament 3 weeks ago. They decided to send lethal weapons to Ukraine, and they also halted Nord Stream 2. But unfortunately, this turning point with Germany becoming a credible military power in Europe is not going to help Ukraine today. Right now, there is concern still that Germany is dependent on Russia. Clearly, this country is going to try and wean itself off of Russian energy sources. But right now, it's difficult because they are afraid of economic repercussions.
And obviously everybody's worried about what we're calling in the UK cost of living crisis with the rising energy bills that everybody will be facing. How much concern is there in Germany about that because of the gas situation, but also how much, on the other hand, is there support for the Ukrainian people? What is the balance?
So the majority of Germans have a lot of sympathy for Ukraine. I mean, the pictures that people are seeing in the news are horrifying and obviously stir up memories of the past. I mean, the 30 years since the fall of the wall have been a time for Germany to really prosper. And it's been a status quo country, but it's realizing that the security architecture is under threat in Europe. And of course, Germany is also under threat. But at the same time, the country is still trying to hold on to its commercial interests because a embargo on Russian energy would cause disruption to industry here and would probably equal job losses. At the same time, people here think they're ready to make a sacrifice. They think that they could, wear warm clothes next winter and freeze for freedom in Ukraine. But I think they don't realize that German industry also requires energy from Russia in order to keep humming. And because nuclear energy is off the table at the end of the year and Germany wants to be carbon free, their gas from Russia is the bridge that's being used right now until this green transformation could take place.
Sudha, it's interesting, isn't it? Because there has been criticism of Germany at the start of all of this from the US and from the UK. And yet, Germany as a nation knows about the influence of the Soviet Union with East Germany for so many years. So is there a sense there, too, of the importance of needing to push back, Russian nationalism and the need for a greater Russia?
Well, Berlin was the center of the Cold War, and it's really interesting now that Ukraine is now the pinnacle of defending freedom in Europe and for the rest of our democracies. And I think Germany remembers the fall of the wall as also being a time when détente with Russia also played a role. But many people forget here that the so-called Ostpolitik of Willy Brandt and other leaders in Germany also took place under the backdrop of deterrence. And as I mentioned, the past 30 years, Germany had a respite from history and forgot that military power is also needed to safeguard our democracy.
Has this brought Europe together? Has this brought NATO together? Are there upsides to any of this?
Right. I think Putin inadvertently didn't realize that his actions, his aggression against Ukraine, the war that he's now unleashed, has brought the Western alliance together like it never has been before. It's given great resolve to NATO. NATO was actually probably going under an identity crisis over the last couple of years. You remember that President Macron had called NATO brain dead and had also undergone much abuse from the Trump administration. But the cohesion among Western capitals is quite impressive. The question is, how long will this be sustainable? And with Germany investing now in its military, 100 billion euro fund for defense and a commitment to reach the 2% NATO commitment is going to open up new opportunities for security cooperation within Europe and also make Germany a leader in Europe.
Sudha, we've run out of time. Lovely to have you on. Sudha David Wilp there talking to us from Berlin. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that was a Sky News special on the war in Ukraine.